Welcome to Tech Trends. Tech Trends is a podcast series that provides perspective on the latest trends in technology, fintech, and digital. On today's episode, we'll provide some insight into recent developments into cloud computing and how companies can take advantage of these latest technologies to power their business. I'm Anish Bhimani, Chief Information Officer for Commercial Banking, and joining me today is Stephen Flaherty, Head of Enterprise Architecture, Core Engineering, and Public Cloud Services for JPMorgan Chase & Company, and a JPMorgan Chase Distinguished Engineer. Stephen, welcome to Tech Trends.
Thanks, Anish. Thanks very much for having me.
So, Stephen, we've talked about cloud in the past, right? But things are changing very quickly and they move very fast. And it seems every time you look up, there's some new development going on in cloud. So what are some of the biggest trends you're seeing right now?
Yeah, it's an exciting time, Anish. Certainly over the last 12 months, we've seen the emergence of many new capabilities and services across all the major cloud providers. But maybe I'll just start by saying here at JPMorgan, we think about the large-scale public cloud providers in really two categories: the hyperscalers that you see with Amazon, Google, Azure, Alibaba, etc., and then the more bare metal construct. And where we're seeing a lot more value-added services delivered in a short period of time is with those hyperscalers. We've seen lots of different trends really start to emerge. In 2019, we've seen things like serverless computing moving from a real novelty into a mainstream capability and starting challenging us on how we think about a drive to zero cost for our business applications. But we've also seen things like edge computing and no longer having to run all of your capabilities, especially in AI, ML workloads in these hyperscalers, but really thinking about what you process on the edge and then really driving towards those kind of core capabilities in the public cloud only when you have to. So we're seeing things like that. We're seeing security first emerging, where the major cloud providers understand the requirements and needs of large companies and small companies about protecting their data. So we've seen a lot of emergence around those different capabilities in the last 12 months.
Just to touch on that right there, in the past, we've talked about security as one of the big blockers to broader adoption of public cloud services. A lot of firms, just for whatever reason, aren't comfortable yet, or the technology hasn't caught up a little bit. So can you say a little bit more about how that's changed over the last year?
Yeah, security services in the public cloud providers came on leaps and bounds, especially over the last 12, 18 months. We've seen the emergence in a lot of financial services area around new capabilities to protect the identity if you're in public cloud. We've seen application level encryption capabilities, key management, even how you think as an enterprise, how you get your data onto public cloud platforms. That whole area has had an emergence of many, many new services that we didn't think were capable before. So you can feel a lot more secure, but we have seen in the past the large enterprises have really wanted to use different cloud providers for different niche capabilities that they've got. What we're now seeing is the emergence of almost some level of abstraction to that allows you to think about the portability of your applications a lot easier. And with that has come, yet again, more abstracted security services. So you can instantaneously get logs, you can query identities across multiple different accounts that you've got set up. So a real force from the cloud providers on how to better secure, and the amount of focus and effort that they're putting in Anish has never been higher than where it is just now.
So that's great. So a lot of progress. It probably opens it up to a lot of people that might have had significant security concerns before. Sure, a long way to go, but a lot of progress.
Yeah, a long way to go still, but we're definitely seeing a lot of enterprises, including ourselves, feeling more secure and feel more confident about moving particular workloads onto public cloud.
So Stephen, in the past, we've talked about public cloud versus private cloud, right? Private cloud being using some of the same public cloud technologies, but on your own premises. Can you talk a little bit about JPMorgan's approach to the cloud and how we're adopting both of those?
Yes, I mean, JPMorgan's cloud strategy really embarked about 5 years ago, and we were very clear at that stage that we wanted both a public and a private presence. Now, the rationale for that was there were certain services in public cloud that we wanted to bring to our client base, but we didn't want to invest the tens of millions of dollars in building them out on-prem. So what we ended up having was an agreed strategy that would converge on a common experience for our engineers that drove towards a private cloud implementation and a public cloud. Now, because of those aspects around public cloud and the relative maturity around privacy and data sovereignty and other pieces that we talked about, we found that our private cloud could accelerate a lot faster and grabbed a huge market share within JPMorgan. And that was running on our own data centers. We used a platform called Cloud Foundry from Pivotal at the time that's now been moved to be merged with VMware. But we found a huge uptick. Our developers were used to running on bare metal, used to running on standard servers. Now they could really tap into that elasticity for their business applications. And it was hugely popular in the last few years. That then took a little bit of a turn, Anish, as we started to see the emergence of Kubernetes in the mainstream and the ability for you to create a containerized application that could span across all of these multiple different computers. That implementation equally has started to really gather momentum. And I would say probably in the last 12, 18 months, our public cloud and our partnership with a lot of the public cloud providers has started to really bring some serious results for JPMorgan, where we've started now to look on public cloud as much more credible across different workload types, because we've hardened those services that those public cloud providers have given as general availability, but maybe didn't meet the high bar that JPMorgan thinks about when we talk about protecting our client data and some other pieces.
Okay, so a strategy, obviously taking advantage of public cloud where we can, but wanting to have an option of leveraging things on premises using private cloud, getting some of the same technologies in place, getting people used to that, and still meeting some of the strict sovereignty and regulatory requirements that we have to do, right?
Yes. Absolutely.
Can you, for people that are unfamiliar, we've talked about containers in the past. Can you explain what Kubernetes is for people that are unfamiliar with it?
Sure. So in the industry, there was a real change that happened, which was called Docker. And Docker really looked to take your application and almost kind of wrap it. And once that application had been wrapped, you had the ability to take whatever was inside that wrap and move it about different environments and different platforms. Now that in a small scale was a real change in our industry, but what really drove things even further was the birth of Kubernetes. And Kubernetes really takes all of these wrappers, and you could have thousands of them, and manages it. It orchestrates it. It makes sure that you spread that compute capability, make sure you have consistent logging, so that you don't get into a situation where one of these wrapped applications or services that you have is having to expand really quickly because you've got a run in the market, or you've got Black Friday or something, and you don't really know how to control this. Kubernetes allowed you to have those reins wrapped around it and allowed you to manage multiple clusters and nodes of these capabilities. It really brought to life how you could really think about the portability of your application and how you really maximize the hardware that underpins your apps.
So that's a key point, right? I think the way to think about Kubernetes and containers generally is it provides kind of a standard framework, if you will, or standard construct into which all of these applications, which are all very different and all that, can fit and make it much easier to port that application from one infrastructure to the other.
Exactly, Anish. And almost to crystallize that, obviously the large cloud providers have their own proprietary APIs and networks and everything else. And it's not often easy for you to build a capability that spans multiple cloud providers. Kubernetes allows you to leverage, as an example, on Amazon, they have EKS, their enterprise Kubernetes service, and you have Google Kubernetes service that sits on Google GKE. We can now take our applications and we can move them to Amazon, or we can then move them onto Google, or we can move them on-prem to our own Kubernetes. It definitely allows you that level of portability. But what I would say is it's very important that everybody always thinks about striking the balance, because you want to use a lot of the native services that are provided on these cloud providers, especially on the really emerging areas of AI and ML. And you want to be able to have them at a relatively quick pace delivered to your clients. If you constantly have to take whatever service it is and wrap it and do some other pieces like that, then you can lose out on some of those areas. So you really want to think about balancing, making sure that your own applications are containerized in the right way so that you've got that level of portability, but make sure you can tap into those native services that are there. If you can strike that balance, I think that's how you win this war.
So that touches on a really interesting point, which is the public cloud providers are known for the speed of their innovation. How many new services do Amazon or Microsoft or Google or anybody else sort of come out with every year, right? And one of the arguments for going with public cloud is to be able to take advantage of the speed of that innovation. One of the arguments for going with private cloud is to have more control, to be able to address some of the security control issues, other things like that, regulatory, sovereignty issues, et cetera. So how do you balance that? What's the argument if you're maybe a smaller company that doesn't have the resources of a JPMorgan? Why would you use a private cloud versus public cloud?
Yeah, Anish, I think really understanding when to go with private cloud and public cloud if you're a large enterprise can be quite tricky, because there's such an evolution on both private cloud technologies and public cloud technologies. You now have even some public cloud providers creating a capability for you to have an on-prem in your own data center presence. So it can be a very, very interesting, but also difficult time if you're starting to think about longer term strategies. My thinking on this, Anish, is if you're small or medium-sized business, to do that initial outlay of having your own cloud provider, your own capability on your own premises, it would have to be an edge case for me. I think I would be leveraging public cloud first. If I was even more concerned about some of the type of workloads I'd be running there, you can pay a little bit extra in a lot of these cloud providers to have a higher level of tenancy, a lower level of tenancy, but higher confidence that your workloads will not be affected by other people's workloads. But I think, when you start to get to that kind of almost that medium to high, enterprise level company, at that point, you should really be thinking about both. There will always be reasons why you'll have to have an on-prem capability, low latency trading applications. Again, some jurisdictions, some data sovereignty is going to take a lot longer, but do you really want your business not to be in that market? Well, can you really afford that? So there's those kind of decisions that need to be made. Within JPMorgan, Anish, we really focused on creating a decision tree. And that decision tree for our businesses, for our engineers, has had probably about 4 iterations in the last 12 months alone, as we've hardened new services and to give that level of understanding and how you course correct projects as well.
So basically, what we'd say to people is think about the kind of work that you're doing, the kind of workloads that the applications have, right? And you would consider things like regulatory requirements, sovereignty requirements of certain countries, latency requirements, maybe security, other things like that. But for smaller companies, generally, you're going to be leveraging more public cloud services just to take advantage of the scale and other things. Larger companies maybe have the option of doing one or the other.
Yeah, exactly, Anish.
One of the things we talked about when we first laid out our strategy was, moving from developers building in a traditional environment to a much more cloud native environment is no small thing, right? So maybe by leveraging private cloud and containers and things like that, they can get used to that, first, other things like that. Can you talk about what that journey looks like and what people are in for as they migrate from the traditional environments to the cloud?
The first thing is you have to make sure you focus on your people. When you're journeying from a kind of legacy on-prem capability to either an on-prem cloud capability or public cloud, you really need to think about continuous learning. You're really focusing on certification for these individuals. And you create an environment where they can play, where without fear, they can develop an application themselves and trial it out. In addition to the learning and development aspect, we create a level of abstraction with our applications as well. So we focus on 2 key elements. One is our application frameworks. We use techniques like Spring, which is an industry-wide framework that really allows your application a level of portability. But in addition to those kind of Spring type frameworks and application frameworks which presents that level of consistency, we also have been looking at our blueprint implementation. So our blueprint implementation, Anish, really looks at a known configuration of each of these different services that we'd use, either on private cloud or public cloud. And that known configuration allows you to stand up an environment with your database, with your compute, with your messaging, and then you can build your business functionality on top of it. So these kind of techniques, coupled with your learning and development strategy, allows your organization to really start to progress.
Yeah, I think you hit on a key point there, right? Because this abstraction concept is a really important one, right? Traditionally, developers had to spend a lot of time thinking about their infrastructure, and I want this server with this much space and this kind of a database and this kind of middleware, et cetera. And the idea now is, how do you abstract away, the infrastructure from the application code? And that enables developers to focus almost entirely on their business functionality they're trying to build and the application level capabilities without having to worry about that. And that's how you get the portability from one place to another. And having those sort of frameworks, whether it be things like Spring or things like Kubernetes and containers and things like that, help with that abstraction that enable you to just do a lot more with it, right? In a previous episode, we talked a lot about resiliency, and the concept of blueprints help you basically to automate a lot of that resiliency. So now the idea is, if you have some sort of disaster, some sort of an outage, et cetera, and you have to rebuild it, you can automate the rebuild of the application as well as the infrastructure underneath, right? So I think that abstraction concept's a really important one that people may not fully appreciate.
Absolutely.
So as you said, we're about 5 years into this, right? So what are some of the lessons learned we've had? Let's start first with just the idea of moving to private cloud and building it out. What are some of the lessons learned we've had with that?
The number one lesson I always talk about, Anish, is start small. Mm-hmm. Right? We always have a tendency to look at a very large business case for a large business application. And even with them, you need to segment it down and start small. People to get a muscle memory around how to use these platforms. Your smartest developers will thrive in these environments once they get their hands on it, because to your point, it takes away a lot of the bureaucracy and a lot of the stuff that, frankly, engineers don't want to be that involved with. So start small, but I know it's a little bit cliched, but even taking your very large application and stepping it up and recognizing the learning that has to happen on your team, injecting talent. Like we have a very broad engineering base in JPMorgan, but we had to go out to industry and ensure that we can get that real deep business expertise and application expertise that we have, coupled with real understanding of platform expertise, and these kind of SMEs in the industry are very useful to that. Maybe the third one I would say in the lessons learned is really, really, really lean on your partners. We had some phenomenal partners on the private cloud space, as we've had in the public space, and they can tell you how other companies of your size in your specific segment have actually done this before, and they can probably even create some meetups so that you can actually sit down and really talk about the war stories. But in the financial services area, certainly in the private cloud, I think it was more about muscle memory. People getting really used to the fact that instead of going through lots of different papers and having to wait for the truck to be delivered with the hardware on the back of it, we could be in a position where with one command line, you could spin up the environment that you wanted. And that was a real game changer for us.
Yeah, a couple other that come to mind, for me is, number one is it's not just as simple as taking the existing application you have and just moving it to the cloud, right? There's a lot of focus on modernizing the application, on breaking it into components and other things like that to take full advantage of this, right?
Yeah, I think that's a huge piece. We did a whole series of talks, Anish, you'll remember this from a few years ago, called Monolith to Microservice. And it was exactly that, people getting used to just compiling their one application and believing that it was actually more secure and more resilient being one application instead of 15 when it was broken apart. But that wasn't the case. You could restructure your teams around those 15 components. They could move at different paces with the right level of isolation between them. So people really thinking about, your microservices, your 12-factor strategies. That education and the work that we had to do to go through that was very sizable, as you know, Anish.
Right. And I think the other point that we talk about being much more nimble or agile, moving to the cloud, breaking up the application into smaller components gives you that agility, because you can make changes on one component of the application without having to do all the big giant testing that's involved with a big monolithic deployment around that as well. It enables you to move faster, right?
Exactly, Anish. And if you then overlay the Kubernetes aspect to it, like we talked about earlier, you end up in a situation where, yes, I've got 15 parts of my application, and wasn't it simpler when we had one? Well, no, with Kubernetes, you can ensure that you can orchestrate everything that's happening in that application in a much, much cleaner way. So those kind of things have all been happening over the last 5 years as we've been on our journey. And I think some of the pitfalls that you've got are things around. One of the great positives out of having these elastic platforms are the ability for you to spin up things very quickly at a huge rate. But with that, obviously, there's a downside, which is if you don't really manage that appropriately, when the music stops, you end up finding out that you've spun up 20 times more than you thought you need. Right. So you have to keep a very, very tight hold and tight grasp over what you're running, where is it running, and how is it running. And that's something that we've learned with a lot of logging, a lot of capabilities that we've brought into the firm to ensure that we can manage that both on and off-prem with a level of consistency. There are challenges like that, Anish. There's challenges around, again, I've talked about us working with our partners and our public cloud providers about hardening their services from a cyber perspective. With those lessons learned, our public cloud providers have become a lot better. You'll have noticed even in the industry at any of the announcements, there's a lot of discussion about data sovereignty. If you want specific services only to run in certain countries where public cloud providers have a data center, they become an option for you to be able to do that. 3 years ago, we didn't have that. So we were trying to code around it. We were trying to understand how we would manage this almost in a kind of command and control construct rather than a configuration setting. So we're finding things like that, Anish, as we've been going through over the last 5 years, that you really need to understand your inventory. You need real consistency around your SDLC toolchain and how you develop and deploy your applications and making sure things are registered in the right way. And make sure that you've got really thinking about day two, because day one is always great. Day one's great. You can spin it up quickly. You can get on there. You can start developing. The day two and you really managing that platform as a going concern is really important, and sometimes people forget that.
Yeah, and that's a great point, right? Which is you think about the the novelty, the excitement of doing this in the first place. And I love your example of, okay, now look how fast I can spin up an environment, and next thing you know, you have 20 development environments spun up, and everybody pays attention to the cost of production environments. Maybe doesn't spend as much time looking at development, and next thing you know, you wake up and your bill for cloud services is 20 times what you thought it would be, because people have spun things up. So I know we have, and a lot of companies sort of run a process that goes through and cleans up unused environments pretty regularly around that as well. Finally, Stephen, a lot of our listeners work for companies that are smaller, maybe don't have the resources of a JPMorgan. As they are just getting started on their journey to the cloud, what advice would you have for them?
Yeah, Anish, for any small company that's starting off here, the thing I would say is start quick, because you can spin up these environments in no time at all, and you can get your engineers to safely experiment. Let them play out with the latest application. It doesn't need to be a very early abstract hello world type construct. You can build capabilities really, really quickly with these providers. I would also lean on these providers to, as I mentioned before, for them to come back to you with examples of companies like you who have gone on this journey, because one of the great things about certainly these hyperscale cloud providers is that they are called hyperscale for a reason. They have brought companies, small companies, to a hyperscale that maybe couldn't or didn't want to invest that outlay on their own data centers or the hardware. So if I was getting into my kind of annualized procurement cycle of new kit for my small company, at that point I would be questioning, or I'd be putting a bit of pressure on the finance team or the engineering team to think differently. Is this really an expenditure that you need to put out there? Like, should you have more flexibility in peak times? Certainly against the current climate, it's very good to be able to spin up really fast and also spin down really fast. If you didn't have to pay for development over a weekend, like, does that really get you the kind of the return that you would be looking for if you were building out your own kit yourself and things like that? So there's a real value for small businesses as well around this, Anish. But the critical thing is to get in there, really start to understand, because you'll find that stuff that you're probably even thinking about building, these cloud providers have probably done it before, and you could probably leverage it. And with that size of company or smaller companies, a big focus on leverage is what I'd say.
So start smaller, but start somewhere, I think is what you're saying around that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to just get moving, because at that point, once you're in there, other things will just appear. Because even in our organization, starting smaller on public cloud, we started to see lots and lots of opportunities emerge that we didn't even plan for at the start.
And the other thing it sounds like you're saying is, look, there's no shortage of capabilities available with these public cloud providers. Like you said, a couple hundred released every year around that too. You're not going to be able to use everything, right? So pick those ones that you want to get started with, get familiar with, et cetera. And also you can get a lot of advantage from using all these services, but you do have to manage them. You talk about being able to turn off, spin up and spin down. My experience is people are really good at spinning up, not as good as remember to spinning it down as well, right? So how you have to manage that as well to get the full value.
Yeah, and I do think that a lot of the hyperscalers kind of market themselves as we will do everything. And there are definite differences in the services across all of these different cloud providers. So doing a little bit of homework, trialing out is very important. But like you say, keep an eye on the bottom line, because the flexibility can come at a cost, and you don't want that, especially as a small enterprise.
Great. So Stephen, thanks very much for sharing your insights, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me, Anish.
And to all of our listeners, if you enjoyed our episode, remember you can rate us and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Tune in next time.